Can you hear me? Or more importantly, see me? Hello. Or anybody else, if you can hear me, please. In all my glory, I don't know about that. For once, it's working. So another 12 live streams, and I'll have the neck of it. I still have 5 minutes. So. Mostly sunny at the moment, at least where I'm living. In some parts of Spain, have snow and cold at the moment. There's snow in Mallorca, so. But this is the Costa Tropical, and as the name indicates, it's usually pretty good weather here. Yeah, that's why I live here, and you live in Germany, Louise. Unless you like blizzards, then it's. We'll wait a few more minutes, and then we can get going. Yeah, in Brazil, it's summer still, probably. So we have 3 more minutes, and then it will be 6 o'clock, my time. It looks like we'll have a small group, but we'll see. I still have a bit of a cough, so excuse me for coughing sometimes in between. It's dragging on a little bit, but it'll be all right in a few days, I think. As you probably know, we'll be showing this little Heidegger Messkirch movie after the live stream. So 7:30, we'll move to Zoom, and I will play the movie there. If you've never been to Messkirch and maybe not have a chance to go to Messkirch, you will find it probably interesting. And if you have been in Messkirch, it will be nice to see it again, probably. You have these YouTubers who probably have 10K participants when they're live streaming. It will take me a while to get there. Hello from North America. Hi, Dawson. Above man with nice names. Pensador, Solitario. So, der einsame Denker. Oh, it's almost time to start. It's always a bit dumb, this waiting. It's the same on Zoom when you're waiting for people to arrive. It's a bit of a no time. Well, you never know. Well, anyway, it's 6 o'clock my time. So, hello everybody. Still getting used to the not being able to see you, which is nicer on Zoom, but we'll make do with what we have. If you've been in before, you can type questions in the chat, and I will read the questions before answering them. And can be anything on Heidegger. Can be questions about his philosophy. It can be questions about his life. Can be questions about academia. So feel free to pose any question you like, and don't be shy. If anybody would like to start things off, then it will be good. There seem to be 8 people at the moment, so is the brave one. And she asked, would love to know about Romano Cortini. Heidegger knew him. Yes, they knew each other. Guardini and Heidegger met in 1915 in a private seminar of Rickers, and they used to go for walks together in Freiburg. So they became friendly. And after the Second World War, in the 1950s, Guardini also came to one of the conferences organized by the Bavarian Academy of the Beautiful Arts, whose Secretary General was Graf Podewils. And with Podewils, Heidegger basically discussed how the conference should be set up, what the topic should be, what people to invite, etc. There would be meetings as well in preparation for the conference. And so Guardini attended one of these conferences, and there's a correspondence between Heidegger and Guardini as well. There are some early letters you can find in Heidegger Volume 1, and I'm not sure if the later letters have been published, but there are about maybe 30, 40 letters between them. So they remained friendly, at least, and met several times in the 50s and 60s. Then we have a question: how maybe explain to those unfamiliar with Heidegger the difference between the concept of the transcendental subject from Dasein proper? Where would be the best place to begin an explanation? So, I'm not sure if I get the question correctly. Well, I'll try and answer, and if it's not what you mean, then just type something and I'll try to adjust my answer. Transcendental subject is a Kantian notion, I would say. It's thus, I think that should be able to accompany all my representations. Dasein is a totally different starting point. Kant, you could say, starts from epistemological questions and takes as his starting point the facticity of science, natural science, and tries to explain how synthetic judgments a priori are possible. Heidegger takes his starting point from the vague understanding of being that all human beings have, and to avoid the complexity of the notion of man or human being, which is historically so, has been interpreted historically in so many different ways. I think he chose Dasein as a word which does not immediately ring all kinds of bells and makes it easier for people to access it. So if you want to start the explanation, you could say that for Heidegger, Dasein is always individuated into Dasein and thus, like human beings, basically. And they are always in the world with each other and are relating to themselves. But itself is not the subject in the Kantian, or even going back a little bit further in the sense of Descartes. So its subject is always related to an object, and that's one of the splits. And basically, it goes back to Descartes' distinction between the res extensa, the extended substance, and the thinking substance, the res cogitans. And the problem is, if you really think of them as two different substances, as Descartes does, or as two different regions of being, as happens basically in neo-Kantianism, then the real problem is how you can ever get them together again. There can be no influence between the two. So in that sense, starting from being in the world and Dasein is always already being with entities, being with other Dasein, thus undercuts the problem, basically. And I would start it from there. So if that helps, just say yes. And if you meant something else, try to reformulate it a little bit. In the meantime, I will go to the next question by Matthew. Can you describe Messkirch for those who aren't familiar? Size of the town, location, industries, climate, geography. How long did he live there? Did his family live there before or stay once he left? Well, that's a nice topic. There is Messkirch is a town which has about nowadays 9,000 inhabitants. It's located, let's say, about 20 miles from Lake Constance, and it was a cultural center, an important center, because the local nobility who ruled the area had a castle in Messkirch. And so Messkirch has a big Renaissance castle, which has been renovated in the late 20th century. Yeah. And it's where Heidegger grew up. It has some industry. Heidegger, there's a factory in Messkirch that makes, let's say, machines you use in professional kitchens, like meat cutters and things like that. Heidegger visited the factory as well in the 60s. But basically from let's say around the late 17th century, Messkirch was going down in importance and was eventually incorporated into the Landkreis of Sigmaringen. Sigmaringen is not a place that you may have much thought about, but it's where the French government under Maréchal Pétain took refuge when Germany was beginning to lose the war. They collaborated with the Germans from 1940 to late 1944. The weather is brisk. It's not a very. The farmland is poor, and it's a little. It's about 400 meters above sea level. It's also close to the Danube River, and close to Messkirch, then this famous monastery of Boiron. Heidegger used to go quite a lot when he was a student, and also later in his life. Well, if you see the movie, you will get some impressions of it. Heidegger's family had lived for a couple of generations already in Messkirch. Originally, they came from Austria, and Heidegger's grandfather was still born in the sheep farm close to Boiron, and that part of the Danube River is called the Easter, which you also may know from the famous hymn of Hölderlin. So Hölderlin was writing that hymn, and he was in the area at the time that Heidegger's grandfather was born, and in one of his lecture courses, Heidegger refers to this fact and says, well, it's maybe no surprise that a thinker whose grandfather was born at that time close to Hölderlin, in a sense, should have such an interest in the poetry of Hölderlin. Heidegger's family, because Heidegger's father was a sexton, so for many years they lived in the house that the Catholic Church provides for the sexton, which is still opposite the church. It's 20 meters from the door of the house to the door of the church. And of course, after Heidegger's mother died, they had to give up the house. But Fritz Heidegger, his brother, had moved back from Berlin to Messkirch, and he got a position at the local Volksbank. It's a popular bank where he worked for many, many years. So there was a reason that Heidegger would come back to Messkirch quite often. And as I will explain in the little movie, in 1938 he started to take his manuscripts to Messkirch because he saw the war coming, and he had also some people who told him that the war was coming. And of course, Freiburg is right on the border with France, so there would be a real possibility of the city being bombed and maybe his manuscripts destroyed, and Messkirch would be much safer. So, because Fritz had a typewriter at his workplace, he could spend his weekends typing the manuscripts of Heidegger. That's why there are so many manuscripts of Heidegger that were typed by Fritz Heidegger. He would make 5 carbon copies, also to spread out the risk of all of them being destroyed. So they were given to different people. The first one he did was Contributions to Philosophy, which Heidegger just finished. Now, basically after Fritz passed away, his son Heinrich, who had become a priest in the meantime, would come back to live in the old house of his father, and he died last year as well. So now basically there are no Heideggers living in Messkirch anymore. There's still relatives there, but there were a few children on the side of Fritz Heidegger. He had 3 sons, one who died already when he was in his 30s, and the other 2, Heine was a priest, so he had no children. His other brother, Thomas, was a forest keeper, and he had 1 daughter who was pretty badly handicapped. Heidegger's sister Marie had 1 daughter, and she lived in not far from Basel, in Säckingen on the Rhine River. So the story of the Heideggers in Messkirch has come to an end, basically. Okay, then we go to Bolsen. Do you know if Heidegger was impressed with and or respected Kahneman's philosophical work? Specifically, Wahrheit und Methode. In his own eyes, did Kahneman do justice to Heidegger's thinking? Well, there are several things to say about it. Of course, the relationship between Heidegger and Kahneman started already in 1923, when Kahneman came to Freiburg after he had read the famous Nathrop report that would lead to Heidegger's nomination as a professor in Marburg. And since Gadamer was doing his dissertation on the supervision of Nathorp, Nathorp gave him this text of Heidegger to read. And he was so impressed by it that he wanted to meet Heidegger personally and attend one of his seminars and lecture course. So in the summer of 1923, he was with Heidegger in Freiburg. If, at the top of my head, in Heidegger's own seminar books, where everybody would write down his or her name who participated in the seminar, he had the habit of putting little red crosses next to the names of people who he thought would be interesting later. And it's interesting to see that basically he always got it right. So you will find this little cross. One of the first is Carl Lewitt. You find it also with Hannah Arendt. You find it with Marcuse. You find it with Gadamer as well. But in a sense, Gadamer is not a student in the traditional German sense of the word, because Heidegger never was his doctor father. They only were, the age difference was only 11 years. And so Gadamer is more a student of Nathorp, who was, of course, one of the leading neo-Kantians, but he had a very strong interest in Greek philosophy and also in medieval philosophy, which was the reason he got interested in Heidegger in the first place after he read his Scotus book, to call it that, the second dissertation that you need to write in Germany if you want to get the license to teach at university level. So Wahrheit and Methode was published only in 1960. And Heidegger was not so young anymore. I think it's always difficult with Heidegger how he really thinks about his own students later. He could be very critical of them, but he, as his basis of his teacher at university is that everybody should find his own path of thinking or his own way of thinking. So I think there is. He would be happy with the way Gadamer developed himself, and he would probably say that Gadamer did not really understand him in many respects, which probably is true. But that's you can see it with a lot of these famous students of Heidegger. Carl Lewitt is another example who went off in his own direction, did his dissertation in Munich on Nietzsche, and is one of the main influences to trigger Heidegger's interest in Nietzsche. You can also think of Hannah Arendt, of course, who Heidegger never really appreciated as a philosopher. You find plenty of evidence of that in the things Hannah Arendt was saying about him, that she had to do as if she had never written a book when she was with Heidegger. So I think there's, in a sense, I think Heidegger was always, I think, also a bit disappointed that nobody really criticized him. That he never found this adversary that he was talking about, who would bring his thinking of Heidegger himself further through an Auseinandersetzung, confrontation, you could say. Auseinandersetzung in German is, of course, this sense of putting something out in its different elements. That never happened, basically. It didn't happen with Jaspers, for example. It didn't happen with our friend who was I thinking of? Well, anyway, Carl Jaspers is an example, and some of his famous students, of course. Everybody went off in a different direction and took from Heidegger what they found interesting and could use for their own development of their own soul, I would say. Then we have a question about the relationship between Heidegger and Bernard Welter. There of course, Martin Heidegger and Bernard Welter were both born in Messkirch. Bernard Welter came from a well-to-do family. His father was chef de clinique of the little hospital that was in Messkirch at the time, which has been long closed. Bernard Welter became a priest, and he was the secretary of Konrad Gröber in the 1940s into the 1950s. And of course, Gröber is let's say, the first fatherly friend Heidegger found in his life. He was the rector of the Conradi house where Heidegger was staying. Was let's say, the seminary for the Catholic boys who went to the gymnasium in Constance. And that immediately put them into different worlds. On the one hand, they were staying at the seminary where the life was more or less organized as in a monastery. There was very fixed hours and a lot of praying and spiritual exercises, etc. And the gymnasium was a humanist gymnasium. There were no Catholic teachers, basically. And a lot of the teachers were free thinkers, or also socialists. And they were talking about things that basically was forbidden for the boys from the Conradi house. You can find Heidegger already there reading Descartes and Kant, who were both forbidden for him. He started reading Dostoevsky, for example. But anyway, to go back to Heidegger and Welter. So Bernard Welter later became the professor within the Department of Theology for philosophy of Christian religion. It was a chair created for him, and he occupied it for many years. Heidegger and Welter met each other from time to time. They were on a friendly basis. And when Heidegger was starting to feel his death approaching in 1975, he invited Bernard Welter and talked with him about his funeral and asked him to do the funeral speech. What Welter didn't know is that he also talked with his nephew Heine about his funeral. So when Heidegger was buried in Messkirch on May 28th of 1976, they were surprised to find the other. But they worked out a way of doing it that was more or less, I think, the way Heidegger wanted it. It was a bit too Catholic for Elfriede Petri, his wife. She was not so pleased with the whole thing. But Bernard Welter gave this funeral speech. It's a beautiful speech that you can read. You can also read the correspondence between Heidegger and Welter. It's been published with also some of the essays that Welter wrote on Heidegger's philosophy. The ironic part was that on the day that Heidegger was buried, Welter became honorary citizen like Heidegger of Messkirch. So in the morning was the burial of Heidegger, and in the afternoon was after lunch was the celebration for Welter of having become an honorary citizen. So when Welter had to go to the party, basically, he said to Fritz, "Are you coming too?" And then Fritz said, "Well, I can't go to a party. I just buried my brother." And Welter then replied, "Aber ich muss doch auch. I also have to go." So Welter went there. I think so. Sometimes Welter is also said to be a student of Heidegger, but he's not really a student of Heidegger. He's somebody who had a different background. He comes from theology and found in Heidegger interesting things that he could use to develop his theological and understanding of religion further. So that's basically on that topic. Then we go back to Matthew. Heidegger had many ongoing prolific correspondences, letters throughout his life. Could you talk about that? Are any of the Heidegger correspondence letters in the Gesamtausgabe? Well, of course, Heidegger must have written something like 20 or 30,000 letters, I think, in his life. We have some very big correspondences. There's one with his wife, which is probably the biggest, which has about 1,200 letters between them. Then there's also a massive one with Fritz, his brother, which also has about 800. Some of the letters, of course, some of the correspondences have been published over the last decades. You all know them probably. The one with Jaspers, with Hannah Arendt, with Welte, with Max Müller, with Bultmann, with Puckler, with Leuwit, with his parents. And they will be published mostly outside of the Gesamtausgabe. In the Gesamtausgabe, you find already some letters that Heidegger published or that Heidegger wrote and were published later, like the famous letter he wrote to Father Richardson as the introduction to his famous book on Heidegger through Phenomenology to Thought. There will be 2 volumes of letters in the Gesamtausgabe, and it will be a selection based on the philosophical importance of the letters, which I still think it's a stupid idea to do the correspondence within the Gesamtausgabe in just 2 volumes. That's why I started with Olga Saborowski, the edition of Heidegger's Correspondence, met een Heidegger Briefausgabe outside of the Gesamtausgabe. So you can publish all these many correspondences. There are, of course, very interesting ones still waiting to be published. You can think of Beaufray, his French friend. You can think of René Char. There are some letters between Heidegger and Celan. There's a pretty massive correspondence with Vittorio Kloosterman, his publisher. There are also a couple of hundred with Günther Neske, who was also his publisher. Then, of course, there's a lot of, let's say, university correspondence over the many years. So it's a long project, and we're trying to publish new volumes as we go along. It's something we do on the side, so it takes longer than if you would have a real, let's say, institution to do it with. If you would pay people so they can occupy themselves with the correspondence on a daily basis, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, then of course things would be moving much faster than when it's being done here and there. One of the problems is also that you can find more or less without too much trouble the correspondence of Heidegger that is kept in public archives, like university archives, for example, political archives as well. But there's a lot of correspondence that is privately owned, and sometimes it's very hard to find the people or to get permission. An example is Heidegger's correspondence with Boss, which is in Zurich in the library, but it's very hard to get access to it, almost impossible. And of course, there may be people who own Heidegger letters that we know nothing about. That's one of the advantages. If you go through a lot of correspondence, you will find new names of people you may have been in touch with, so you can try and find them and see if there's something that sometimes there's very little to go on. There are still a lot of big correspondences that need to be published. The whole thing will be 30, 40 volumes at least, if it's ever finished. Well, basically, Louise was asking about the correspondence outside of the GA. That's what I basically have been talking about already now. So, let's see. I've been editing some of these volumes. The first one I did was Heidegger Record. I discovered the letters by. That's maybe a nice little story. When I had this idea of doing a Heidegger biography, I got in touch with Hermann Heidegger, and he gave me a list of names of people I should visit. Because already in those days, a lot of these people were getting pretty old. Gadamer was, of course, an example, who was 96 or 1907. Don't remember exactly. When I visited him in Heidelberg. So, and as I was in Heidelberg, I also visited the University Archive in Heidelberg. Originally because of Emil Lask, a student of Heinrich Rickert, who died on the battlefields of the First World War in 1915. Heidegger is influenced by him pretty strongly in those years, and was also hoping to do some work on the Nachlass of Lask to see if there would be interesting stuff. So Lask would become more known as he was at the time. Unfortunately, there was nothing there of interest to me, but then I had this, in hindsight, brilliant idea to ask if he also had something on Heidegger and Rickert. And he had the complete correspondence as far as been preserved of Rickert. And there were about 13, 14 letters in it from Heidegger. Now, if somebody has quite a few letters of Heidegger, it means that the correspondence meant to Heidegger. So I got a copy of the letters. I tried to read them. I spent, I think, 4 hours at the desk and figured out 3 or 4 words in that period. And when I showed them to Herman Heidegger, he was very surprised that nobody had looked there before. And then he checked his own list of the stuff that's in Marbach in the Deutsche Literaturarchiv, the German literary archive, which is the biggest place where they keep letters and manuscripts in Germany. And there were, I think, 30 letters of Heidegger. There were 30 letters of Heidegger to Rickert in Heidelberg, and there were 13 letters of Rickert to Heidegger in Marbach. And then he told me I should do the edition of the Correspondence. It's one of those famous yes or no questions, where if you say no, it's the end of the conversation. So you better say yes and try a way of doing editorial work. If you've never done it before, you can't read his handwriting, which I can now a lot better than I did then, at least. So. But it shows you, if Heidegger kept 13 letters of Rickert, it means that it meant something to him. There are lots and lots of letters that Heidegger burned. One example is, of course, Hannah Arendt. Her early letters before, let's say, 1933, were all burned by Heidegger. So we don't have those anymore. And that's the case with more people. There's a lot of correspondence where you still have the letters of Heidegger, but not of the person he was corresponding with. Sometimes you're lucky, and the person writing to Heidegger keeps copies of his own letters, as is the case with Binswanger, for example. So we're doing the edition of the Binswanger Correspondence, and also with a few letters with Frankl in the upcoming volume of the Heidegger Jahrbuch 14 on Heidegger and psychiatry. And that's the first time that will be published. So that's, I think, about enough about the correspondence of Heidegger. There is always a possibility that some letters may show up later. There were some letters from Blochmann to Heidegger that were found later and are not in the published edition. Because Heidegger put them in, he would put a lot of letters in books, and sometimes he wouldn't remember where he put them. And instead of going over all the books in Heidegger's library after his death, within the first 2 or 3 years, they never did that. Sometimes Hermann Heidegger would take out a book and find letters of correspondences that had been published in the meantime. The same happened with Löwit. I'd finished the edition, and then Ulf Heidegger send me an email, I found 5 more letters. And then you have to incorporate them in your prepared text. And that means that everything shifts. So you have to, it's a lot of work that could have been done much easier if they had been there from the start. Well, what was Kahneman like in person? I think I had seen Kahneman before. He was in Messkirch for one of the conferences of the Heidegger Gesellschaft. And he was already then 92, 93 years old. Old man, bent over, walking with a cane. He gave a presentation. And the interesting thing was when he started talking, he became, as it were, twice as big. And his voice was still a very carrying voice. So he could speak, and everybody, I think even people outside of the room would hear him speaking. And it was really impressive. And of course, he was in an age where you can just talk about your memories, basically. So he was talking about Heidegger in the 1920s. And it was in a very impressive experience. Then it becomes interesting because I'd met the director of the Catholic Academy in Freiburg, who organized during Heidegger's lifetime one of the first conferences on Heidegger thinking. And one of the invited speakers was Kahneman. And Kahneman said, well, I will come and talk about Heidegger, but only on the condition that Heidegger is not present when I'm giving my speech. And so it was agreed. There's another story about Heidegger would come to Heidelberg, since he was also a member of the Academy of Sciences of Heidelberg, and be present in the seminars of Kahneman. He would do the same with Fink or Max Müller. He was always interested in contact with the students until the day he died, basically, to learn what they were thinking, what their concerns in life were, so to get a feel of what's happening today. But when Heidegger came into the room, to people who were there, Kahneman disappeared, basically. He would take it over, and everybody would be touched by this charisma that he had. So if someone like Kahneman was so impressed with Heidegger, it shows you something about him and the influence he may have had on his students as well. That was extraordinary. Yeah, but I think Heidegger is Kahneman in once more. It's of course, one of the interesting things is also that Heidegger acknowledged that in the early 1920s in Freiburg, when he was developing his own thinking and finding his position in contemporary philosophy and figuring out what he wanted to do as a philosopher, he was surrounded by these people like Löwit and Ebbinghaus and Schilassi and Oscar Becker, and of course also Husserl and a bit earlier Rickert. So there was just this small group of very, in a way, brilliant people who were all joined in a quest to renew philosophy after the end of the First World War. And that's something they all shared, I think, finding new ways of promoting thinking. You can also think of Elisabeth Blochmann, whose correspondence with Heidegger has been published and is also interesting. Another example is the correspondence with Hannah Arendt. In the later edition, there's one letter added to because it was found also later. It's now published at the end of the book, not in its place within the correspondence, because they will be too expensive. You would have to reprint the whole thing again. And now you just add one page and you can run it through. Anyway, go back to Gadamer. So I met him in Heidelberg. He invited me to come to his house, and he opened the door and said, "Well, let's go into my study." And he had a big writing desk. And there were stacks of papers on it. And then he said, "Well, the Heidegger letters were here somewhere, but my cat must have pushed them off the table, and I can't find them at the moment." Eventually, they turned up, and I think there must be about 200 letters, the Heidegger Gadamer Correspondence. It's still being dragged out. It should have been published already a couple of years ago, but there's a disagreement between the Ulf Heidegger and the daughter of Gadamer about the way it should be done, etc. And well, I sat down. He sat in his chair, and he said, "Well, you've come to see me, Dr. Denker, because of Heidegger?" I said, "Yes, Professor Gadamer. As far as I know, you you knew Heidegger pretty well." And then he started talking for 2 hours, although he was 93 or 94. And it was 4 o'clock. We met at 2 o'clock. He stopped, and he had prepared a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses. And then he said to me, "Sie trinken doch auch gerne ein Gläschen Rotwein, Herr Dr. Denker?" It's another of those yes and no questions. I said, "Yes, I would love a glass. Thank you." So he poured me a glass, and he poured himself a glass. And then he started talking again for another 2 hours. I didn't have to say anything, basically. And in the meantime, we finished the bottle of wine. And then at 6 o'clock, he said, "Well, I'm getting a bit tired, so it was very nice to meet you, blah, blah, blah." And I still have some letters, I think, from Gadamer somewhere. So that's one of the funny parts of being a biographer. That can be something you are. But there was also a reason for me to start doing it. It would be a chance to meet a lot of interesting people. I went to see Walter Biemel, was also over 90 years old at the time, in his house in Agen, which is close to the Dutch border. And he was pleased that he got an opportunity to speak about Heidegger and say the things he still thought were important at the end of his life, because he knew his life was also coming to an end. And we have that interview in the archive in Messkirch. I think I've shown it a couple of times already. It's something we can do also, show some of this stuff. Of course, Gadamer was a very different personality than Heidegger. He came also from his father was a professor already, so he grew up with classical music, people playing the piano, the violin. Was a man of the world. He traveled all over the place, at honorary doctorates from, I think, 6 or 7 universities all over the world, from the US to Japan. He was a late bloomer, because his most famous work he wrote when he was 60. He was 60, 1960. And he, of course, he lived to be 102 years old. So, like Ernst Jünger. Well, let's move on from Gadamer to. Are you familiar with the philosopher filmmaker? Yeah, I know Terence Malick. And there's a story about Malick visiting Heidegger to have his copy of Silent signed. I didn't know that story, so I can't say too much about it. Visiting Heidegger was something a lot of people did. There's also a reason why Elfriede was guarding the door and sending people away as well. One of the people who called upon Heidegger without any appointment, was Victor Farias, who wrote his book on Heidegger and National Socialism. And he was a bit pissed off when he was sent away without seeing Heidegger. And that's why a lot of people don't like Elfriede, because he would be the one to say no. Yes. Okay, could you please explain Heidegger's relationship, his method boss, and the main facts about the relation up to their falling out with one another? Okay. Method boss read Being and Time, I think, during the Second World War. He was, of course, Swiss, so he was living in Switzerland. In Switzerland, I was not involved in any of the two world wars because they were always neutral. And Method Boss was a trained psychiatrist who also was interested in psychoanalysis. So he went to Vienna to see Freud, and he met Freud, and how far he ever did the learning analysis with Freud is still up for debate, because Boss liked to embellish his stories as well. And some of the stories he told have little bearing in reality, so they're not always true. But anyway, when he was reading about Heidegger's concept of Fürsorge and this two ways of it, Einspringen, so the jumping in and taking over the care of someone you care for, opposed to the jumping ahead, the more kind of liberating, opening up possibilities for the other. He thought that was a pretty perfect description of what he was trying to do as a therapist, a psychiatrist. So he decided to write a letter to Heidegger. To his surprise, Heidegger replied to his letter. I think one of the things that attracted Heidegger, one was probably that he was always interested in promoting, in quotation marks, his work outside of philosophy and see how it could help people. And of course, if you think about something like therapy, psychiatry, if you have some influence through your thinking on those things, it might be very rewarding. And that's probably the reason that Heidegger replied to him. And then Bos came to see Heidegger and met him in Totenberg at the cabin. And they became more or less friends. And Bos would invite Heidegger to Zurich, first for one seminar, and then afterwards he would invite him twice a year for about 10 years to come to Zollikoon, which is a suburb of Zurich, to do these Zollikoon seminars. And they went on holidays as well together with their wives. Heidegger liked his first wife very much. She and he got on pretty well. So that's how they started working together. As you can see now from the Gesamtausgabe edition of the Zollikoon seminars, which contains about 900 pages, 800 pages, something like that. There is time Heidegger spent in preparation for these seminars, and how seriously he took them, and how difficult it was for him to explain his thinking to, let's say, medical, natural scientific trained people. So it was often not so easy for Heidegger, and not so easy for the people participating. And that reports that it was all very interesting and very going very well. There are also reports that some people couldn't make sense of Heidegger. So the reason they fell out later is that Heidegger was involved in Bos' main work, the Grundriss, the fundamentals of psychiatry and medical medicine. And Heidegger, or Boss, incorporated in his preface about half a page to a page of text that was written by Heidegger, but he didn't indicate it. So people would think he wrote it himself. And when Heidegger saw that, he was very pissed off, to use that word. And for him, it was a reason to say, it's the end of our relationship. I will not make this public because of the friendship we have shared over these many years. But please refrain from writing to me again. That's basically the end. And of course, you know that, or you know probably that in Bos' own edition of the Solicon seminars, he did the protocols of the seminars that were recorded or stenographed and added conversations he had with Heidegger. So that's Bos reporting after Heidegger's death on what they have been discussing when they were on the way to Sicily, for example, in an airplane. And he also published some of his correspondence with Heidegger. If I'm not mistaken, there's not one complete letter in it. And at the same time, he left out in Heidegger's last letter, where he's stating that he's refraining from meeting Bos again and cuts off the relationship. So that's why it would be interesting to have the full correspondence, which runs also to about 250 letters. Let's see. Yeah, like Dawson is saying, some philosophers flourish early, like Wittgenstein and Hume, and others are late bloomers, like Kant and Kant. Of course, Schelling is another example of somebody who was a very early bloomer. He was also very brilliant. On the topic of Heidegger and the great Asian traditions, is it true that Heidegger began working with a Chinese scholar on the translation of the Chao Chi Ching? That is true. The scholar was a professor for Chinese language at the University of Ulm, and he lived in Augsburg, and Heidegger would meet him, and they were friends as well, a couple of times, and they would work on trying to translate the Tao into German. And if you think of Heidegger's famous saying that language is the house of being, then there are different houses of being. One being, let's say, the Indo-Germanic house of being that the French and the Germans and the English live in, which is dominated by metaphysics, Heidegger would say. And Chinese, or the Indian languages. Chinese is, of course, also nobody speaks Chinese because of different Chinese languages. But they are different worlds. How to explain? If you think in being in time, the existential being in the world, there the world is empty. It's more or less a horizon, a receding horizon within which we live in a concrete historical world determined by the language we speak, for example. So if you want to really translate, let's say, the Tao Te Ching into English, you have to move from one house of being to the other one. And that for Heidegger is the big problem. How is that possible? Of course, there is, you can translate it into your own language, but then you're basically losing what is different in this other language, because you're translating it into your own terms. You can also think about our own tradition. If you think of the Greek word physis and its meaning, if you translate it as nature, you lose the original meaning of physis. So you just make it into something it is not. So there is, Bos is maybe here also an example. Bos was very much interested in the Indian traditions. And he made a long voyage to India and spent about 9 months, but living also with several of these sages and learning from them, but also through sharing their life, living in their world. And I think that's the way you can do it probably. But you have to be careful. And that's what Heidegger is warning about often when people talk about translating. It's a translating. It's a going from one world into another world, and you have to bring out what is different, what is strange in this other world. If you just incorporate it into what you already know, there is no sense to it. And I think that's what you can see in a lot of the English translations. And that's then it becomes a kind of crypto Californian existentialism, to put it unpolitely. But you lose this whole tradition and then the deeper meanings. It's one of the interesting things if you do seminars like I'm doing, close reading of text like The Event by Heidegger. You're basically translating it also into English. And if it's one of the main things we do is try to, based on the translations that are available, which always have many defects and are often misleading, but still you can use them as a tool. But I think you need a knowledge of the German language if you want to make sense of what the English translation often is saying. And if you discuss the different meanings that words have, it's working out these different meanings that words have in German, which you cannot translate into any English word. So you have to explain it and bring out the fullness of the meaning. And if you do that, then you're becoming aware of the strangeness of what he's saying. And he's trying to move beyond metaphysical thought, beyond this calculative thinking that we're so used to, and how difficult it is to do it. It's something that Heidegger is really very hard trying to do. I'm not jabbing at anyone because crypto Californian extensionism, but it's not a jab to drive us. I think it's one of the things we can learn from Heidegger, how difficult it is to translate. Even if you try to translate Heidegger's German into English or into French or into Dutch. And Dutch is then easy compared to most other languages because it's very close to German. But even there you can go wrong sometimes. Where words have the opposite meaning. So it's an interesting topic, and it's one you find a little bit of it in this conversation with the Japanese that Heidegger published in On the Way to Language, where they try to bring out the meaning of the Japanese words for language, which is then explained as cherry blossom. So that takes a little getting used to, although according to people who speak Japanese, it's a bit of a construction also by Heidegger. So, but anyway, it shows how he's trying to listen to language. I think that's one of the interesting things that Heidegger in Being and Time is creating language, inventing all these new neologisms, like being in the world, being towards death, being ahead of oneself, which is fine for formal indications, but makes it very difficult often for people to get into it. And Heidegger is not always very careful about the way he's using his own created language in Being and Time, you could say. And the later Heidegger is listening more and more to what language is saying. Language speaks. You have to listen and hear what language is saying, and then try to correspond to it. And in Germany, of course, for corresponding, the verb entsprechen, which is bring out in your speaking about it. The sense that's already in the language. Then we go on to Marc-Antoine. Is Heidegger's dissatisfaction with the care at the end of his life only a form of dissatisfaction due to the misuse of the term, or a philosophical one? I think it's a bit both. As I see it, and it makes the notion of the care a bit maybe superfluous in a sense. How shall I put it? I think Heidegger, something I discovered, let's say, in the last few months, way of thinking is a way of thinking. So there's a unifying element in it, but it always consists of several passes of thinking that he's following at the same time. And on his way of thinking, he's focusing on one of these passes at a time. So Being in Time itself is an example of it. The whole, if you look at the whole complexity of things that Heidegger was working on, let's say from 1919 to 1926, you can see how he's incorporating different elements from these different paths of thinking into this one structure of Being in Time. And that also means that things he has been talking about, let's say in 1922, or even earlier, an example is Bezinnung, which is a term he uses and explains in a 1915 essay published in a local newspaper that nobody knew about until I found it. Is something he leaves on the side. And then in the, let's say in the later 1930s, he brings it out again and starts rethinking from this path of thinking that he abandoned in 1915, basically. And then you get to this manuscript, Bezinnung, which is misleadingly translated as meditation, but it's very difficult to find the right word, because in Bezinnung, you have this word Sinn, which means sense. So Bezinnung is concentrating on the sense and trying to bring out the sense and following it. And of course, the first question in Being in Time is, what is the sense of being? It is not the question, what is being, but what is the sense of being? So being in its ising is always sensing. And that's why human beings have, as an existential, according to Heidegger, sense. It's the capacity to disclose the sense that being is making. And you can rephrase it then also in the notion of address, Zuspruch and Anspruch. But Anspruch is more like a demand, a claim. So being claims us through its speaking to us. And at the same time, being needs us, or Dasein. This is the famous word Brauch that Heidegger uses in his translation of Anaximander. Brauch in German, you can hear in two different ways. There's brauchen, so you need something, and you can gebrauchen, make use of something. And in Brauch, you have this double meaning. So being uses human being, and at the same time needs human being. And human beings need being, and at the same time are using being. So then, if you think of this one way of thinking, of ever shifting paths he's following, then there is not a real Kira, I think. Heidegger, already in Being in Time, he's thinking beyond being in time in many ways. which of course you can only see if you look at his later writings. I think one of the reasons that people like to keep the notion of the Kehre, it's simple in a way, but if you say that in Being and Time, Heidegger is trying to think from human beings towards being, and after the Kehre, he's thinking from being towards human beings, there is some truth in it, but at the same time, it's too simplistic. And if you then put it in the political context and the problems we all have with Heidegger in 1933, 34 at least, if not longer, then the notion of Kehre would be very helpful, because then you say Heidegger turned away from his involvement in politics and became the pure thinker he was basically at heart and should have stayed. And you can get rid of the whole problem of National Socialism by saying, well, it's only on a personal level. It's a personal mistake. Heidegger admitted that he didn't see clearly, but it has nothing to do with his philosophy, which also, in my opinion, is too simplistic. It's a very complicated topic. You need some bravery also to try to be honest to what Heidegger is saying, because a lot of misinterpretation going on, where people are not understanding terms that Heidegger uses in Heidegger's own terms, what he means by it, but say, he talks about National Socialism, which is the Holocaust, which is the World War, which is the total catastrophe. So that would be my take on the Kehre, on the turning. I hope that adds something. You can, this 1915 article you can find in Becoming Heidegger. It's a big volume edited by Sheehan and Kizil, which has a lot of these early writings by Heidegger in English translation. I published it also in the Heidegger Jahrbuch, volume 1, and before that in the Messkirch Heimathefte, very important source for Heidegger studies. But it's basically a little journal that's published by the Society for History and Heimat in Messkirch. But you can find it in this if you want to read it. It's also interesting that he also mentions Nietzsche there a little bit more than maybe the first time that he says something serious about Nietzsche. But if you want, I can send you, if you drop me an email, I will send you the PDF of the whole volume. Louise is back. I heard that when Heidegger first visited Holland, he was overwhelmed by the sheer flatness of the landscape to the point of feeling physically ill. Have you heard this? Yes, I've heard that story. Of course, Heidegger grew up in a hilly country. Messkirch is hilly, and the Black Forest is a middle mountain range. Mittelgebirge in German. So it goes up the Black Forest, I think, to 1,600 meters or something. Veldberg, which is the highest mountain in the Black Forest. Heidegger the mixed, I think, as he often has, mixed feelings about Holland. It's a different world from Messkirch or Freiburg if you go to Amsterdam, where he was invited to give these lectures. He also gave one in The Hague. The most important thing, of course, was Heidegger's meeting with the paintings of Van Gogh. When Heidegger came to Amsterdam, just before the first exhibition of Van Gogh's paintings had taken place in Amsterdam. The descendants of Vincent's brother, who had inherited all the paintings of Van Gogh, he sold one painting in his life, so there was a lot of paintings left. So they decided to get in touch with the municipality of Amsterdam, and they were willing to donate the paintings and all the stuff they had of Van Gogh, the letters, etc., if there would be a museum of Van Gogh in Amsterdam. Yeah, so it was the first worldwide exhibition. Funny enough, this year there will be something similar happening with Vermeer, which will be an exhibition in Amsterdam. But I think they have 27 or 28 of the 32, 33 known paintings of Vermeer altogether. So when Heidegger was there, you could still visit the exhibition, and you saw there for the first time, let's say, the oeuvre of Van Gogh, which of course you find in the famous lecture on the origin of the work of art. And if you know that he visited the whole exhibition, and in that sense discovered the world of Vincent van Gogh, or the different worlds, when he started out in Holland painting with dark colors, with simple farm families, then moved to Paris, and from Paris then to the south of France, where he started painting the most famous paintings we have of him. With a lot of the colors, the yellow, which was unheard of using yellow in a painting. So there's that, and of course some Dutch people stayed friends with Heidegger. Some of them had a correspondence with Heidegger. One of his assistants was a girl from Holland. So, but I think Amsterdam was maybe too liberal and too open for his taste. Then we go to, you mentioned Heidegger's handwriting was affected after he suffered a stroke. Are there other dramatic changes in Heidegger's handwriting in his career? Well, you can see it. Basically, he was writing very small letters during and after the First World War, because there was a lack of paper. And so when he's using really his handwriting is very small, and you already know it's from that period. His handwriting changes a little bit over the years, so there's a noticeable difference between, let's say, the late 1920s and the 1950s. But it's these are all tools of making philosophical thought accessible that were rejected, let's say, by the Heideggerian Vatican. They didn't believe in that kind of nonsense, collecting the letters, trying to date his handwriting based on. But it will become an interesting topic, by the way, at some point. As you may know or may not know, I don't know if you know or do not know, when the Gesamtausgabe is finished, which it is basically, there will still be about 25,000 notes, which range from just a word to maybe a couple of pages of one text. And the plan is to do 2 or 3 volumes dedicated to these notes, to be selected, among others, by Arnold Heidegger, God forbid. But I think it would be a much nicer idea to scan the whole thing and put it on the internet, so that you have that everybody can work with them. Because the first thing is then to do a transcription of the notes, and it's not easy. But people can correct and say, well, you read this word as in such a way, but I think it's another word. And then you could also try to make some kind of temporal scheme say this must be very early and this is the later Heidegger. So that's one of the things you can would be interesting. And maybe you can find then also notes that belong together, so you get a bit of a more completed text. Let's see, then, because time is running out a little bit. There was a long 10-year period where he did not publish anything. Is there any noticeable change in his handwriting before of this period? Not immediately, I would say. Heidegger never published much in his lifetime. It's also something to keep in mind. The Gesamtausgabe is, of course, 102 volumes, but he published sometimes just because he had to publish, which is the main reason the Being and Time came into being. And of course, shortly afterwards, he published his Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. But after that, it's some small text like What is Metaphysics, on the essence of the ground, on the essence of truth. During the 30s and 40s, there's very little, a little bit of on Hölderlin, for example. So there is, and of course, he was writing all these lecture courses during those years, and also the manuscripts then from 1936 on, like contributions to philosophy. But it's one of the also the difficulties if you want to work with the manuscripts. If you can't read his handwriting, you can go to Marbach, but you can do nothing. You can only, one thing you could try is to compare the manuscripts to the published versions and see if there are differences in between, or where they left out maybe some papers or some notes or changed the writing. But that's stuff that few people are interested in. The person who did it the most was Ted Kizil, God rest his soul. He did a lot of groundbreaking work, I think, in that respect. I always honor him for that. We did some stuff together. Tried to dig out some of these things. An example is that if you turn over the pages of the lecture course Heidegger did in Marburg, in some cases on the backside you find parts of the text that he wrote for his lecture courses between 1915 and 1917, when he had just done his habilitation. And so you have a little bit of information about the contents of these courses. Unfortunately enough, we know very, very little about them. For a lot of later courses, we have also student transcripts, so that gives you an idea of what he was talking about. But for these very early stuff, it's very, very little. So did Heidegger ever have any correspondence with any English people, or have any invitations to lecture or visit England? Yes, there have been some few people, some English people. He was invited. There was a plan to invite him to the US. There was a plan to invite him to Argentina after the war. And of course, some of his, several of his students, of course, had to flee to the United States, like Hannah Arendt, like Jonas, Chris Teller. In England, he found a place for his assistant, Broch. So he had a little bit of contact with England. And of course, Elfriede, when she was a girl, around 17 years old, she spent a year with her parents in England. So he had some knowledge of the place, probably. Let's see. Let me get. Okay, let's see. For Heidegger, what is his most important books? Do you mean his own books or books that he read? I think basically what he published are for him his most important books, I would say. That's why he published them. He could have published a lot of other books, but if you look it's one of the things you can learn from his correspondence, for example, with Neske, how much time and effort he put into putting together these collections of Vorträge and Aufsätze, so of lectures and essays. And there are several different contents pages. So he moved in some papers that he later left out. So you can see him struggling. It's also something that comes up in his correspondence with people who were proofreading for him at the time, like Tuckler, for example. Beyond two known brief mentions of Wittgenstein, I wonder if Heidegger had a serious opinion about the philosophical writings of Wittgenstein. I don't think so. He had the Tractatus in his personal library and the philosophical investigations. But they were not, he didn't annotate much. I'm not even sure if there's one, maybe one or two little things, but not much. So he did read Russell and White at Principia Mathematica. That is a work he studied. But this Wittgenstein was not really somebody he ever worked on seriously. Then we go to the next question. Heidegger suffered a stroke. Do you know when, what type, location, cerebellum, etc.? Well, he had the stroke in January 1917 when he was with his professor of Chinese in Augsburg on his way to Ulm. He was going to Ulm, but the stroke prevented him from going there. And there's the final letter in the correspondence with his wife. It's the letter that he wrote while he was having the stroke. So if you look at the original page, you can see all of a sudden his handwriting goes down. So there's he was paralyzed of his body, and he couldn't write. He couldn't speak for almost three months. As Friede said, wrote in on that letter that the most beautiful time of their marriage began after the stroke, because Heidegger couldn't leave her anymore. He could not have secret meetings with certain women anymore. At the same time, it's pretty depressing, I think. So, of course, Heidegger always had a lot of influence from his students who would be working on Wittgenstein or other philosophers. So it's he knew about things, and there's always. Unfortunately, we don't have his complete library anymore. There were basically three parts. One was in the old home they built in the garden of his house in Zeringen, where Hermann Heidegger would meet with Tietjen and von Hermann concerning the Gesamtausgabe, and they had the hand copies of Heidegger of the philosophical text there. So it's the copies he used of the works of Kant, Aristotle, Heraclitus, etc. And another part was still in his old office in the house on the Reuterboek, and that was basically secondary literature and copies of books that people had sent him. A lot of people would send him his dissertation, of course, accompanied by a little letter saying, please allow me to present my dissertation to you. And if you would have perhaps 2 seconds to have a look at it and could say one line about it, I would be most pleased. But of course, Heidegger got so many that normally he couldn't have no time to look into it. But you find some interesting books in there. I think we have on the Heidegger forum, you can find a PDF of the different parts of the library, and there was the third part was in Marbach already, which were the main editions of philosophical writings. So you have there the complete edition of Descartes that he had been given by Graaf Cookie as his thanks for his private teaching he did with him. He was one of the first people from Japan that Heidegger got to know on a more personal basis. And he also went on to Paris from Freiburg to study with Bergson, for example. So, and a lot of the let's say on the history of art is in the possession of his granddaughter Almut in Munich, because she studied the history of art. She got those books. So, and Heidegger gave away a lot of books as well, and he sold quite a lot as well to make some money. But it's about a stroke, basically. Pick up on of course, Miles mentioned in the chat that he was invited to lecture in Washington in 1961, but it never materialized because of the people objecting to his Nazi past, basically. And of course, in those days, there were also strange rumors about Heidegger and claims about things he had said and done, which were totally unfounded. Like he had forbidden Husserl access to the library, for example, as a rector. He never did. And well, I think so. Let's see if there's something else, or we can move over to the Zoom. I will turn it on in a minute. I think I went over most of your questions. Of course, always feel free to send me an email if you have something you would like to know more about, or you didn't have a chance to ask now. We'll do another one in next month again, so you can save it for the next time. I'm just going to say thank you for participating in my little live stream. It's always enjoyable, and I hope you got something out of it. Then if you want, you can move to Zoom, and then we'll show you the little movie on Messkirch guided tour of Heidegger's hometown. So I'm going to close this, and hope to see you then in 1-2 minutes from the other side. See you.